Ever get that feeling where you're following a news story
Yeah.
and you think, okay, I get it.
Yeah.
But then something happens and you realize, oh, there's way more to this than I thought.
Absolutely. Like another layer you got to peel back.
Right. Exactly. And that's kind of where we are with this whole Donald Trump and a third term as president thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's been popping up more and more, right? And it's got people wondering if it could actually happen.
Yeah. His recent comments have definitely thrown some fuel on that fire. I mean, it's a question that goes right to the heart of how the U.S. government works, you know?
Totally. So for this deep dive, we've been looking at a really informative BBC News article that breaks down the whole thing.
Oh, yeah, the BBC one.
Yeah, that's the one. It looks at the Constitution, what's being said, the legal side of it all, really well laid out.
Mm-hmm.
And our mission here isn't to predict the future or anything like that.
Right.
We just want to understand what the rules are, what are the possibilities, and what are the experts saying about this whole potential scenario.
I think what's really got people talking is how Trump's tone has changed, right?
Oh, right.
Like the article points out, he recently said he's not joking about a third term.
Yeah.
And that's totally different from how he used to brush it off as fake news.
Huge shift. Okay, so the heart of this whole thing, right, the foundation, is the Constitution. What does it actually say about how many times a person can be president?
So it all comes down to the 22nd Amendment, which was ratified back in 1951. And it's pretty clear. No person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice.
Okay.
There's some stuff in there about what happens if someone takes over midterm, but the main point is you get 2 elected terms. That's it.
Seems pretty clear-cut on that elected part.
Yeah.
But the article also gets into how you actually go about changing the Constitution. It's not easy.
Oh, not at all. Changing the Constitution is a big deal, and it's designed to be that way.
Yeah.
You need 2/3 of both the House of Representatives and the Senate to agree. And then, get this, 3/4 of all the states have to approve it too.
It's a lot.
It's a lot of hoops to jump through.
And thinking about the current political scene, just getting that 2/3 in Congress seems like a massive hurdle.
Huge hurdle.
The article mentions that the Republicans control both the House and the Senate right now, but they don't have that supermajority, that 2/3 needed for an amendment.
Right.
And then on top of that, you've got the Democrats controlling a bunch of state legislatures. It was 18, I think.
Yeah, 18. So you can see how changing the Constitution, especially something as fundamental as presidential term limits, is a really tough ask, especially in today's political climate.
For sure. Especially something this big.
Right.
Okay, so changing the Constitution itself seems unlikely. But then the article goes into these potential loopholes, ways people are suggesting that the 2-term limit could be, I don't know, worked around.
It's like sidestepped.
Yeah, exactly. And the main one seems to be this idea that the 22nd Amendment only talks about being elected, not succeeding to the presidency.
That's the one that's been getting a lot of attention, especially among some Trump supporters.
Yeah.
They're arguing that the amendment doesn't directly say a former president who's already served 2 terms can't be vice president.
Okay.
So their theory is Trump could run as VP, win, and then if the president resigns, boom, he becomes president.
It's creative.
For sure. And the article even mentions Steve Bannon, who seems to believe that Trump's going to run and win again, and has hinted at a couple of alternatives to make it happen.
Right.
And this VP to president idea seems to be one of them. But it feels like it goes against the spirit of the 22nd Amendment, right?
Oh, totally.
Like, is it really okay to interpret the Constitution that literally, especially to potentially evade a rule?
It's a good point. Has something like that, interpreting amendments in such a specific way, has that ever happened before?
It's a really good question, and it gets to the heart of legal debates, right? It's one thing to follow the exact wording of the law, but the intent behind the 22nd Amendment was clearly to stop one person from having too much power for too long.
Right. I think trying to get around that through some VP maneuver would probably face some serious legal challenges, based on the purpose of the amendment in the first place.
That makes sense. There's also that Representative Andy Ogles, who the article mentions, who's proposing a constitutional amendment that would allow presidents to serve up to 3 terms, but they couldn't be consecutive.
Right.
And that non-consecutive part is really interesting.
Yeah, especially when you think about the living former presidents, right?
Right, because like the article says, only Trump would be eligible right now because Obama, Clinton, and Bush all served 2 terms in a row.
Exactly.
So it feels pretty targeted, like we were saying before.
It does make you wonder, right?
Yeah.
Like, is this just about wanting to see Trump back in the White House?
Yeah. But the article's also realistic, saying that even this proposed amendment is a pipe dream.
Pretty much, yeah. Like
Yeah.
we talked about before, amending the Constitution is super hard.
So many hurdles. So many hurdles. So, yeah, it might get people talking, but it's probably not going to happen. Which brings us to, like, what do the real legal experts, the people who study the Constitution in detail, what do they think about all this?
Right. That's a great point. And the article brings in some of their perspectives, which I thought was super helpful.
Yeah.
Like Derek Muller, he's an election law professor at the University of Notre Dame.
Oh, I know his work.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
He had some really interesting things to say about the 12th Amendment, which pretty much seems to shut down that whole VP succession thing.
That's right, the 12th Amendment. It's mainly about the process of electing the president and VP, but there's this important part in there that basically says if you're not eligible to be president, you're not eligible to be VP either.
Aha, interesting.
So Mueller's interpretation is that if you've already been president for 2 terms, you're constitutionally blocked from being president again, which means you're also blocked from being VP.
Makes sense.
Right. And he actually uses this great phrase. He says there's no one weird trick to get around term limits.
Uh-huh. That's great. No secret cheat codes for the Constitution.
Exactly.
And then there's Jeremy Paul, a constitutional law professor at Northeastern University in Boston. He seems even more straightforward in his opinion.
Oh, yeah. Paul's very direct. He says flat out that there are no credible legal arguments for a 3rd term.
Wow.
So that seems like a pretty clear sign that constitutional law experts agree. The 2-term limit is solid, and these loopholes just aren't going to work.
So legally, a 3rd Trump term seems really unlikely.
Yeah.
But to understand why this 2-term limit is so important, we got to look at the history, which the article also does a great job of.
Yeah, good point.
So let's talk about FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
He's the only president in U.S. history who served more than 2 terms, right?
Exactly. He was elected 4 times and actually died early in his 4th term. And the article does a good job of explaining the unique situation back then. I mean, think about it, the Great Depression, World War II.
Unprecedented time.
Totally. Massive national crises, one after the other. It must have been incredibly intense.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine what that was like.
And what's really interesting is that back then, there wasn't an actual law saying how many terms a president could serve.
Really?
It was more of a tradition, a super strong tradition, though, started by George Washington himself.
Oh, wow. So it was really Washington who set the standard.
Yeah, his decision to step down after 2 terms created this precedent that lasted for over 150 years.
Wow. But then FDR comes along and wins 4 elections in a row.
And that's basically what led to the 22nd Amendment in 1951.
So the 2-term limit became a law because of a president serving more than 2 terms.
Yeah, exactly. It kind of solidified the idea that 2 terms was enough no matter what.
It's fascinating how that all played out.
Really highlights how important and permanent they intended the 22nd Amendment to be.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now let's look at the reactions to all this talk of a 3rd Trump term.
Because politically speaking, this is a big deal.
Huge. And, no surprise, it's getting strong opinions from all sides.
Yeah.
The Democrats are definitely not holding back. The article quotes Representative Daniel Goldman, who says it's yet another escalation in his clear effort to take over the government and dismantle our democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And there are calls for Republicans in Congress to come out and publicly oppose a 3rd term, you know, if they
Right.
really believe in the Constitution.
It's a challenge, for sure.
A big one. And what's interesting is it seems like some Republicans are also hesitant about a 3rd term.
Oh, yeah.
Like Senator Mark Wayne Mullen, he's quoted saying he wouldn't support changing the Constitution to allow a 3rd term unless the American people were clearly on board with it.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it shows that even within the Republican Party, there's not total agreement on trying to work around the term limits.
Yeah, it's not a simple black and white issue.
Not at all. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here.
A lot of ground.
Let's just recap the main takeaways. The 22nd Amendment says 2 elected terms. That's it. Changing the Constitution to allow for more.
Practically impossible.
Yeah, especially with all the political division right now. And the whole idea of that succession loophole going through the VP route.
Doesn't seem legally sound.
Right. Experts like Derek Muller are pointing to the 12th Amendment as a major roadblock there.
Yeah, exactly.
And we also saw how FDR serving 4 terms actually led to the very amendment that's being debated now.
Full circle.
Totally. And politically speaking, this whole issue is a powder keg.
For sure.
So listeners, we've really dug into this question of a 3rd Trump term. And what we've seen is that while there's a lot of talk about it, the constitutional and legal hurdles are pretty massive.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue with a lot of different angles, and we've tried to give you a balanced look at all of them.
Exactly. We looked at the legal limits, the more creative interpretations, the historical context, and the political reactions.
And as you go about your day, listeners, think about this. History and politics can really shape how we understand and maybe even change those core principles of the Constitution,
Mm-hmm.
even the ones that seem totally settled. It makes you wonder, what other parts of our government, things we take for granted, could be questioned or challenged in the future in ways we don't expect? Our democracy is always evolving, always being debated, and that's something to keep in mind.
It really is. Food for thought, for sure.
Definitely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. Until next time.
See you then.